Alright, welcome to part 2. Now that we've taken apart the transmission, let's replace all the bearings and other wear components and get it ready to go back together. Now with the transmission case bare, take the opportunity to give it one final soak in the parts washer. Now let's get the 3 shafts bare ready by starting with the most complicated, the output shaft. First, the 4th gear synchro ring and the thrust bearing can be removed. If you didn't already know, 4th gear isn't actually a gear. By moving this slider forward, the input and output shaft are directly linked to provide a 1-to-1 ratio. This slider hub is held in place by a snap ring. I found I need a larger set of pliers to remove easily. Take note that there is a dot on each slider that faces towards the rear of the transmission. Here there is a small thrust washer that rests between the slider hub and the snap ring. Besides the dot, you can see there are some other small differences between the front and back of the slider. This is 3rd gear. It is resting on a set of needle bearings that can also now be removed. The spacer is part of the shaft and won't be removed. Instead, we will remove the remaining parts from the other end of the shaft by pressing on the 2nd gear. Once the bearing is pressed off the shaft, 1st gear can be pulled off along with its spacer and bearings. Then pull the slider assembly and finally 2nd gear. I carefully lay all the parts out in order to keep track of how it all goes back together. As you probably now expect, take a minute to clean the disassembled parts. And now the obligatory slow motion pour of the fluid. Use the recommended fluid for your transmission. The M5OD happens to use conventional ATF. Even though these parts are new, it's good to give them a good wipe down in case there are any shavings or debris left over from machining. If you have to rebuild any slider assemblies, there are two large snap rings that hold 3 keys that help retain the slider to the hub. Carefully take these apart and clean out the splines. On the slider, there are 3 teeth that have a relief cut for the key. Make sure when assembling that these reliefs match up with the key slot. I wasn't happy with my footage for that slider assembly, so this is when I rebuilt the 5th and reverse slider. The assembly process is identical. Just make sure to take note if the hub has a front and back and if it is assembled in the correct orientation with the slider. First, place the slider on the hub, with the mentioned key reliefs in the correct orientation. I found it easiest to first place the snap ring on the hub. There is a hole that it will index to. The ring should pass all key slots. If not, the ring may need to be flipped. Next, place the keys in the slots. The keys have teeth to hold onto the snap ring. These face inward on the hub. The keys can be inserted by gently pulling back on the snap ring. While holding everything together, flip the assembly over and install the second snap ring over the keys. Now reassemble everything in reverse order it came off. Lubricate the needle bearings in oil. The new brass synchro rings are slightly porous, so it's a good idea to soak them in transmission fluid sometime before the assembly. You'll find there are 3 notches in the synchro rings. They need to be lined up with the 3 keys in the slider assembly. If done correctly, the ring will have some wiggle room, but will not be allowed to freely spin. Now, the first bearing needs to be pressed on. By heating the bearing, the diameter will slightly increase and it will be easier to press on. I used the old bearing and some 1 3/4 DOM tube to tap the new bearing into place.
In case you're not visualizing that, 90 degrees would be...
Make sure all pressure goes into the inner race of the bearing. You do not want to push down on the outside of the bearing or you may damage it. Then make sure the bearing is fully seated and the gears still spin freely. Turn the shaft around and install the 3rd gear and 3/4 slider. Then install the snap ring washer and the snap ring. You may notice I placed the thrust bearing on backwards. I would recommend leaving it off for now anyway. It fell off about a dozen times before I had everything installed and back in the transmission case. Now, onto the countershaft. All that is needed is to remove the inner race of the roller bearings. This can be done with a standard bearing puller. Once again, I use my high-tech bearing heater to heat up the race before installing. There is a similar race on the front of the countershaft, but for some reason I forgot to record it. The input shaft is also fairly straightforward. First, remove a plastic oil slinger that's in front of the bearing. Next, cut the outer race in half to remove it and expose the inner race.
Yeah, I could probably go. I think it says something as well.
Hold on, I'm zooming in on the camera. We're gonna figure this out.
Yeah, my point is you might have.
Place a bearing clamp on the lip of the inner race and set it up in the press. Once pressure is being put on the bearing, use a torch to heat the race. When it expands, it will eventually pop loose. Watch for it to give me a surprise.
It's a similar box.
Heh, what a dork. Just like heating the bearing, cooling the shaft will help installing the bearing. Just don't tell my wife I was putting car parts in her freezer. The new slinger has notches that line up with indentations in the shaft to keep it indexed. Okay, that's it for this video. Check out part 3 to see the transmission set up and ready to go back in the truck. I hope this helps you in your project, and thanks for watching.